whether or not Jesus was a Jew. Now, I'm going to say Jesus was absolutely not a Jew, and I'm going to give you my reasoning for this. Um, there's been a lot of debate around Christmas about Jesus being a Jew or Jesus being a Palestinian. There was the Pope who swaddled the baby Jesus nativity scene in a keffiyeh. This caused a lot of controversy. People were saying he wasn't a Palestinian, he was a Jew. What are you doing? People were lecturing the Pope about this. But let's have a conversation about whether or not Jesus was a Jew. And why this matters. Now, I am not going to go and make the case that he was a Palestinian. I'm not sure if he was or if he wasn't. I haven't really thought a lot about that, whether or not he would qualify as a Palestinian. I will say he was clearly treated like one, considering he was killed. So that was very Palestinian-esque, I would say. But I'm not here to have the conversation or the debate about whether or not Jesus was a Palestinian. I'm going to focus specifically on whether or not Jesus was a Jew. And this is a conversation that is very specific for Christians and some Jews. But this is mostly aimed at the Christian community. So if you are a Muslim, for example, or an atheist at this point, this still is a conversation for you, and I'll tell you why it should still matter to you. But it is understandable to me why Jews would claim Jesus is a Jew. It's understandable that they would say he was a Jew and he was a heretic, and that's why other Jews persecuted him for claiming that he was the Messiah, and he wasn't. He was just a heretic, and he was killed for it. He was executed for it. If you're a Muslim, you would say Jesus is a Muslim. I am specifically aiming this at the Christian community who continues to believe that Jesus was a Jew. And I'm also aiming this at the Jewish community who keeps telling the Christian community that Jesus was a Jew. Now, why this matters. There is an entire nation murdering people right now for not being Jews in order to create a Jewish nation. So the definition of what a Jew is matters, especially when your children are being outcast from their homes and killed for fighting back, all because they're not, all because they're being excluded from being a part of a Jewish nation, a quote unquote Jewish nation. Now, much of the Christian community supports this massacre, favoring the group that calls themselves Jews over the group that doesn't call themselves Jews. And there's a variety of reasons why Christians support it. There's the end of times prophecy. So you've got a group of Christians out there that will support this beginning of the Jewish nation because they believe in an end of times prophecy that says there would be a great gathering of Israel back into that homeland. And when the gathering of Israel happens back in Jerusalem, the Messiah will return. So you've got a group of Christians who are believing this is what's needed to happen in order for the second coming. But there's also a group of Christians that support this because of what they call Judeo-Christian values, with Jews telling Christians that Jesus was a Jew. And so that's why you should support us, because your Lord and Savior was a Jew. And there's a reason why this narrative has come about. It wasn't always the narrative that was out there. But the first big reason why there was this push after World War II for people to start saying and for it to be part of the more mainstream discourse inside of Christian communities to point out Jesus being a Jew, the biggest first reason was to prevent persecution. This is very understandable. After the Holocaust, a lot of Jews would say, "What are you doing? Jesus was one of us. How could you be against us? How could you do this to us?" And I think that is a really understandable reaction, is to say, why would you kill us? Your God was one of us. But that has evolved. And I think the main reason why Jews today would say Jesus was a Jew and try to convince Christians of this is to gain support for the creation of Israel and the horrors that it takes to make it happen. So again, the idea of your God was a Jew, so you should do everything you can to help us because we're the people of your God. And then the average Christian goes, "Oh, you're right. Jesus was a Jew. I love Jews. So yes, I will do anything to help you out." That is why this matters, because even if right now you don't believe in any of this and you think it's all mythical and it's, and you're just a total atheist, there are a lot of people in the world who do believe this. And they believe this with every fiber of their being. There's no convincing them otherwise. And they are now supporting genocide because their beliefs have been twisted in a way that is not being corrected. And I think it needs to be corrected in order for these people to get on the right path again and not support genocide. Now, some people will say to me, Kim, it doesn't matter. Genocide is bad no matter what. It doesn't matter what people believe. None of that is relevant, but it is. Because again, you're not going to convince people who believe in religion. You're not going to convince them by saying, look, genocide is bad no matter what, and you should just agree with that, and you should just stop supporting it. They're still going to support it if they believe that this is what their God wants them to do. Now, I will say before going into this, I don't believe in any of this anymore. I was raised Christian. I was raised in a Catholic family, also a Buddhist family. So I got kind of both sides of that. But also, then I did convert to Mormonism. People will say Mormons are not Christians. I would say the Christian umbrella, when we talk about Christianity, it includes it includes the various different Christian Protestant sects. It also includes Catholicism, Mormonism, anybody who believes Jesus is the Christ, we're going to put under the umbrella of Christianity. But that also, by the way, the reason why people don't call Catholics Christians, or the reasons why they'd say Mormons are not Christians, is similar to why I'm going to say Jesus was not a Jew. It's important. The language is important. It's important to know who you are supporting and why exactly. And most importantly, what if you're wrong? So if you're a Christian and you're thinking, well, I got to support the Jews and the creation of Israel because this is going to bring about the second coming of the Messiah. What if you're wrong on who the Jews are? So you have to have a definition of who they are, which really, the Revelations don't talk about Jews. It talks about Israel, the gathering of Israel. That is all the 12 tribes of Israel, not just the tribe of Judah. That's all 12 of them. So you'd have to be able to make this definition if you're going to believe in this stuff. And by the way, once again, there is no archaeological evidence of any of these people existing. This is a faith-based thing. So if you are a faith-based person watching right now, 100% this is about faith, and that is okay. But there is no actual archaeological evidence of any of this, of any of these people. There's no archaeological evidence of Abraham. There's no archaeological evidence of Moses. There's no archaeological evidence of Jews ever being in Egypt. There's no archaeological evidence of any of these people ever existing. Some of you might dispute that. There's interpretation of some archaeological evidence, but there's really no set in stone, agreed upon archaeological evidence of any of this. This is why faith is important when it comes to faith. But what I'm going to say is that if you are a Christian, it's odd to believe that Jesus was a Jew by the definition that we understand the word to mean today. It meant something different back then, and we're going to go over this. So the idea that Jesus was a Jew didn't come into common public discourse until after World War II. The first English translations of the Bible did not refer to Jesus as a Jew. They used terms like of the seed of David or other references to Jesus's lineage. But the term Jesus was a Jew didn't come into existence until about the King James Version of the Bible, which is the early 1600s. That's when it was first mentioned, most famously in John 4, when the woman from Samaria, where it says this, then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, how is it that thou being a Jew asketh, drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria, for the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. It was also brought up in John 18:35, when Pilate answered, am I a Jew, thine own nation, and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me? What hast thou done? When Jesus was brought before Pontius Pilate, and Pilate is basically saying, why am I here dealing with Jewish things? I'm not the Jew judge. Like, why am I being told I have to deal with this? So that is the references to Jesus being a Jew. But here's the thing, and we're going to go over the common arguments in favor and then my responses to them. But the first step is we have to define what is a Jew, and we have to understand the biblical translations of Jew. So first of all, is being a Jew a religion? And this is just defining what is a Jew is, I think, it's extremely important to the people who are being massacred right now. There's a big group of people saying, we're the Jews, you're not Jews. We're able to kick you off this land. This is our land. God promised it to us, right? So then the question I think everybody should be asking is, well, then what's a Jew, and what qualifies somebody as a Jew? Is it a religion? Is it based on genetic bloodline? Like if you're a direct descendant of Judah, Abraham, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, which Israel, And then Judah, are you then a Jew? Is it someone born in Judea? Or is it just simply if your mom's a Jew, you're a Jew? So back in biblical times, I think it's important to remember that it wasn't matrilineal. That changed somewhere along the line hundreds of years later, but you're never going to find any matrilineal lineage written in the ancient texts anywhere. It's all patrilineal. It's Abraham begat Isaac, who begat Jacob, who begat Judah, right? That's how the lineage is always going. It's always male, patrilineal. That's how it is. So today, the identity of Jews amongst Jews themselves can't even be defined. They can't even define what is a Jew. So this is the crux of the issue. How can you say Jesus was a Jew when you can't define what is a Jew, even today? Israel can't even define it. The definition keeps changing and widening. They say, well, it's not explicitly religious because there's a lot of Jews today who are totally secular. They don't believe in religion at all. So then they say, well, because it's more of a culture, it's an ethnicity, but how could it be a culture? It can't possibly be a culture when you've got all these various different cultures. You've got Persian Jews that have completely different culture than Ashkenazi Jews in New York, who have a totally different culture than Ethiopian Jews, right? So they're not even culturally the same. In the culture, the only thing that they would have that is culturally the same would be the religious aspects, which then goes back to, well, then is it a religion? And if it is a religion, then how can all of these non-religious people claim to be Jews if it's actually based on a religion? Right? So then they say, well, just don't even ask these questions. Don't even bring it up. Obviously, a Jew is a Jew. You should just know what a Jew is. That's what we're told all the time. And it's like, wait a minute, you're literally killing all these people because they're not Jews. Don't you think you should tell me what a Jew is? I mean, shouldn't it be made common knowledge and available to people to understand this so that people know whether or not they can be saved from your bombs? I mean, that would be like a nice thing to know. It's not a race, obviously, because you got Jews in Ethiopia who are black. You've got Jews and Ashkenazi Jews in New York and New Jersey who are totally white. You've got Russian Jews who are also really white. You've got Persian Jews. You've got Iraqi Jews, right? You've got them all over the place from different races. You've got Asian Jews. So these are not, so it's not a race. It's not a bloodline because you can convert into it. There's a couple of reasons why it's not a bloodline, but one of them is you can convert into Judaism. And if you can convert into it, then suddenly you're a Jew. It's clearly not based on bloodline. Also, it can't be strictly bloodline because it would have to be from Judah. And again, there's no archaeological evidence of these people existing. So there's actually no distinct bloodline that trace. But let's just say for those of you who are faith-based, because this is really the people I'm talking to, you would have to do the genetic testing then, and people would have to prove that they are a direct descendant from Judah in order to be called a Jew. Now you might say, well, no, it's just all of the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, then you'd be an Israelite. We'll get into that though, because that actually matters as well. So defining this is of utmost importance, especially since people are literally being killed over this. So that's the first thing that I'm going to say is it needs to be defined. The term Jew historically was reserved. So first of all, the word didn't exist. That's not the word they used. They used Yehudim, which then was translated into Greek, which then was translated into Latin. And then we've translated that into meaning Jew when we put together the Bible or groups of people started to identify as Jews, when that is not actually the term that was used. The term that was used was Yehudim, which literally means people of the tribe of Judah. Okay, so that is from the tribe. You are a direct bloodline from Judah, and just the line of Judah, forgetting the other 11 tribes of Israel, just the line of Judah. That is what makes you a Yehudim. However, after the Babylonians and the fall of the first temple, it then was translated into kind of, I guess I should say that the word then kind of grew in the meaning of the word, started to expand to include all the tribes of Israel. So anybody who was an Israelite was kind of brought into the term Yehudim because those from the tribe of Judah were most prominent. They were the most powerful, and they were the leadership really in the religious, in the Abrahamic monotheism religious movement. And so people just kind of were put under the umbrella of Yehudism, even if they came from all these various different tribes. And by the time the Romans came around, the Romans kind of called all of them, everybody who believed in Abrahamic monotheism, whether they be from the tribe of Israel or not. They could have been Greek followers of monotheism, Turkish followers. They could be any follower of Abrahamic monotheism. By the time of Jesus, the Romans kind of called anybody and everybody who believed in that Yehudism, or Yehud, the Yehudi. They used a different term. They used a Latin term, but that's essentially what it translates into, which we now in modern day translate into Jew. But it means something different in the Bible than it does mean today. So same word, different meaning. It's like saying Indian, right? There's Indians from India, but we also call Native Americans Indian. So that kind of gets confusing for people. Or using the term Christian, which then involves a lot of different sects. And a lot of Christians would say, look, Mormons aren't really Christians or Catholics aren't really Christians. But it didn't really matter to the Romans because the Romans, they were only concerned, they weren't caring about the individual beliefs of the various different Abrahamic monotheistic believing people. They didn't care if some of them believed in oral tradition, or if some of them believed in the writings only, or if some of them were essentially becoming or were Christians. They didn't really care. They just found it extremely threatening. They found Abrahamic monotheism threatening. The idea of an almighty God that was above and better than all of the Romans and their emperors was threatening to them. So they had their eye on this group of people, and they called them the Yehudi people, essentially. People of the tribe of Judah is what it originally meant back in the day of Abraham, or the beyond Abraham. And by the way, Abraham was not a Jew. How do you explain that? Who was the first Jew? Judah was the first Jew. Abraham wasn't a Jew. Isaac wasn't a Jew, but Judah was a Jew. And all of Judah's offspring were Judes, we should say. And that then term kind of went and became expanded, and then it started to include all of these other tribes of Israel, and then it started just including anybody who believed in these Abrahamic monotheistic faiths to the Romans. So there were a lot of different sects during the time of Jesus. There were the Sadducees, there were the Essenes, there were the Zealots, there were the Samaritans, there were the Nazarenes. So in the Bible, when the Samaritan woman refers to Jesus as a Jew, she doesn't mean you're a Jew religiously. They were actually both Abrahamic monotheistic believing people. She meant you're from Judea and I'm from Samaria, and our two regions are at war and we don't like each other. Why are you talking to me? And that is where that comes from. It's not you're a Jew and I'm not a Jew. It's not you're an ethnic Jew. It was you are from this region that we are outcast from. We don't have dealings with. I'm from a different region. We don't cross paths. It's kind of like the Israelis and the Palestinians, right? We don't cross paths. We don't like each other. So why are you even talking to me? That is what that was referring to. It wasn't meaning you are a Jew ethnically. They were actually the same. The Samaritans, in fact, viewed themselves as the true Jews, and they actually viewed, or the true believers of the Abrahamic monotheistic faith. They believed that their version of Abrahamic monotheism was the correct version. They believed that the Pharisaic version, which was the most prominent version in Jerusalem, that was mostly the Judean people, was heretical. And that is, but they still were from that Abrahamic monotheistic belief. So Jesus was a Nazarene. He was not a Pharisee. He was not an Essene. There was some of the apostles who were. There were some apostles who were Pharisees that converted. But Jesus was a Nazarene, and his followers were called Nazarenes. There was no full identifying term for Jews back in the day of Jesus. They didn't say, you're a Jew, I'm a Jew, we're all Jews. They didn't actually view themselves even as Yehudim people. That was something the Romans called them, but they did not identify with one another. They did not feel like they had any sort of affinity with one another. That just wasn't actually a thing back in the time of Jesus. So there were these different sects. The Romans didn't care about the different sects. They just were worried about these people rising up and worshiping an almighty God. They were worried about an average everyday man named Jesus that people were starting to worship, and that's what their concern was. But today's modern Jews, and when we say Jews, what we actually mean are rabbinic, how do you say it? It's rabbinic Judaism. These are really the Pharisees. So this was the sect of Judaism, the Pharisee sect, that survived after the fall of the Second Temple. But there was another sect of what you would, I guess, call Judaism that survived, and that would have been the Nazarenes. We today call the Nazarene sect of Judaism Christians. and we call the Pharisees Jews. So today, when we say Jesus was a Jew, what people are trying to tell you is that Jesus was a Pharisee, but he wasn't a Pharisee because they're equating the term Jew from what it meant back in the day to what it means today. And it has a different meaning today. And today it is Pharisees. It's the Pharisees who became the modern Jews, and the Nazarenes who identified as Jews, but not, again, not using that term. That term was not in use. So this gets really confusing because that wasn't the term that was in use. But the Nazarenes and the Pharisees identified as the same religious group, but they had very different religious beliefs. The Nazarenes believing Jesus was the Christ, and the Pharisees not believing that. Today, we have two different words for these two different groups. One of them is called Christians. The other is called Jews. Jesus was not a Pharisee. Jesus was a Nazarene. That's a Christian today. Now, if you want to be technical, and you want to say, well, okay, but for the time, at the time of his being, he was a Jew, and the Pharisees were Jews, and the Nazarenes were Jews, and they were all Jews. It's actually not even true. That's still not even actually accurate. What is a Jew? So let's go over some of the common arguments, and we'll break this down. People will say Jesus was a Jew by birth, heritage, and practice. He called himself a Jew. So did Paul. Jesus actually never once called himself a Jew. There is no biblical reference whatsoever to Jesus calling himself a Jew. Paul did. Paul was a Pharisee. He was a Pharisee from Turkey who ended up converting to Nazarene and became one of the apostles, one of the most prominent apostles to the Gentiles. But Jesus, people will say, was a Jew by birth. Again, what was a Jew by birth at the time of Jesus? A Jude was somebody born from the tribe of Judah. So this is what people will point to. They'll say Jesus was a Jew by birth, and that is documented well in the Bible in Matthew and in Luke, that they go over his genealogy. And therefore, and it goes all the way back, all the way to Judah and, King David, and then all the way back to Judah. So Jesus was a Jew. But if you're a Christian, you can't believe that Jesus was a Jew by birth based on those genealogies when you believe that Jesus came from a virgin birth, that Joseph was his adopted father, not his actual biological father. So legally, Jesus would have been a Jude from Judah, from the tribe of Judah. He would have legally been through his adopted father. Of course, most people at the time did not know he came from a virgin birth. So they would have assumed that Joseph was his real father, and he legally would have had the right to the throne, being the king in the prophecy. And this is what Christians are hung up on is they say, well, Jesus had to have been from the line of King David because that's the prophecy was the Messiah would come from the line of King David. But this is why God told Joseph to marry Mary. He says, yeah, I know she's pregnant. Marry her anyway. I know it's not your kid, but marry her. Why? Because then the prophecy would be fulfilled. Otherwise, why would God care? People say, well, that's because at the time, if Mary was unmarried and had a baby, then she would have been persecuted or killed or whatever. But this also, as was documented in the Gospel of Matthew, documented that Jesus came from the line of King David through Joseph, directly through Joseph, his adopted father. But that wasn't his actual dad. If you're a real Christian, you believe that Jesus he's divine. And that's the only acceptable answer about Jesus's paternal heritage. People say, well, Mary was a Jew. We actually don't have a single recorded record of Mary's genealogy. We don't know. Now, people will speculate and say Luke's genealogy was Mary's because Luke's is different than Matthew's. Not every scholar agrees with that. That is not explicit. That's an interpretation. We don't have any direct evidence of Mary's lineage. A lot of people say Mary was actually not a Jude from the tribe of Judah, but she was a Levite. People say, well, Jesus was a Jew because he was a rabbi. Well, at the time, Language is a funny thing. Language morphs and transforms, and a lot of time people don't have multiple words for the same thing. They use the same word for the same thing because they haven't gotten creative enough yet to come up with a new word. But at the time of Jesus, rabbi just meant teacher. It was just the word for teacher. There was no religious. That didn't come until after the fall of the Second Temple, where rabbis became more of a religious thing inside of Judaism. Back in the time of Jesus, rabbi just literally meant teacher, just somebody who goes around teaching, and that's what Jesus did. They'll say, well, Jesus taught in synagogues. Well, again, synagogue was just a Greek word for a gathering place. It didn't mean, the word didn't exist for church. It didn't exist for cathedral, or it was just synagogue. They went to synagogues. There wasn't, Christianity, the Nazarenes that left and were persecuted, and the more powerful group of Jews wouldn't allow them to call themselves Jews. Instead, they were called Nazarenes. And then they eventually adopted the term Christianity. They started to want to differentiate themselves a bit more. And so they started changing the language, changing the words from synagogue to churches, from rabbis, let's say, to priests or whatever. But fundamentally, so you could get into this argument of saying, well, Christianity is Judaism, and therefore Jesus was a Jew because Christians are Jews. But no Jew will agree with that today because the word has a specific meaning. And that is my point. My point is the word has a specific meaning. And Jesus was a Christian. Now, people say, no, he wasn't a Christian because Christians follow Jesus. Jesus didn't follow himself, but Jesus actually did. There was a reason why Jesus got baptized. He said, I also have to follow. I have to not just talk the talk, but I have to walk the walk. He absolutely believed he was the Messiah. He preached it. He believed in the Holy Spirit. He believed in baptism. He believed in communion. He brought it out during the Last Supper. So Jesus was actually a follower of the faith that he was preaching. He wasn't just, I'm the God and you're going to follow me. He also followed his faith. So he himself was a Christian follower, essentially. The sect of Judaism that he believed in was Christianity. That's not the term they used back then. They didn't call it that. The early Christians believed they were following true Judaism. They believed they were the real Jews. I mean, that is what they believed. So if you're going to use it if you're going to this is where words get tricky, right? If you're going to translate, well, Jesus was a Jew because all of those Christians were Jews, fine, we can go down that road. But then Jews today aren't Jews. They're Pharisees. You would have to just say they're all Jews. Everybody's a Jew. Christians are Jews. Jews today are Jews because that's the Pharisees and these are the Nazarenes and they're all Jews. Okay, fine. Then we can widen the term. And I think that's actually probably more accurate, is to widen the term. And probably many of the Palestinians today are Jews. If you're actually going to go by the actual true definition of what Jew should mean, which still doesn't, because it's from the tribe of Judah. So if you're going to get really specific and say it's from the tribe of Judah, then you've got a lot of people who just don't even qualify because there is no evidence that Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. If Mary came from Levi, he was a Levite. His father was not Joseph, guys. His dad was God. So he wouldn't have been a Jew from the tribe of Judah in that under that interpretation either. People say, well, the cross said Jesus of Nazareth, King of Judea, right? It was initials, INRI. That was the Romans mocking. When people say, oh, but the cross said he was King of the Jews, that was mocking. They were mocking the Pharisees. They were mocking the Sadducees, the Pharisees. They were mocking all of these people and being like, oh, look, here's your king. And they actually said, don't do that. Don't write that on there. He's not our king. Don't write that on there. They were just mocking them. I mean, for goodness sakes, they stuck a crown on his head, but it wasn't a real crown, was it? It was a crown of thorns. So that was to mock. That was meant to mock. And Jesus never said, this is who I am. He said, I am divine. He never said he was the king of the Jews. Jesus read from the Torah, people will say. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. Again, Christians read the first 5 books of the Bible. Does that make Christians Jews? I will go along with Jesus as a Jew if you're going to start saying Christians are Jews and we're going to change the definition of the word. But because we're not really going to do that in today's society, and Jew means a very specific sect of Judaism, we're going to stick to that definition and that meaning because that's what most people are talking about when they say Jesus is a Jew. They're trying to get you to believe Jesus was a Pharisee, essentially, and that he believed in, that he was one of the modern day Jews and from that group, and he just wasn't. He was never a Pharisee. He was totally persecuted by the Pharisees. They'll say, well, Jesus adhered to Jewish law. That's not true. He was introducing new laws. He emphasized the spirit of the law rather than the strict adherence to the letter. He was bringing in an entirely new religion, a new belief system entirely. They'll say, well, Jesus identified as a Jew. He was part of Jewish culture and identity. There was no such identity at all during the time of Jesus. They were not all in agreement of their various different sects of Abrahamic monotheism. They did not identify together, and Jesus never once identified himself as a Jew. Again, they'll say Matthew and Luke's genealogies trace Jesus back to David through his adopted dad. That's not actually who he was. He was divine. That is the only appropriate response from a Christian to believe, if you're Christian. The Samaritan woman, how is it that thou being a Jew asketh drink of me, which am I, woman of Samaria, if the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans? That again was just two warring different areas that had nothing to do with ethnic identity. That was about geography. People will say, well, the apostles were Jews. Well, no, they weren't. The apostles were from Galilee. They were Galilean. Some of them may have been Greek, ethnically Greek, actually. Some of them had Greek names. The area of Galilee, people say, well, a lot of Jews lived in Galilee. Well, again, it depends on your definition of Jew. If you're talking about the tribe of Judah, no, Galilee was filled with people from the tribe of Naphtali, Zebulun, and Asher for the most part. And all of the apostles were Galilean except for one. The only true Jude on the list of apostles was Judas. He was the only one from Judea. The rest of them were from Galilee. People say, well, no, when we say Jew, we mean religion. We mean that then none of them were. They were Christians. They were Christians, fully and thoroughly. So either Jew means you are ethnically from the tribe of Judah, or you're referring to a religion. And if you're referring to a religion, then they absolutely were not Jews. And if you're referring to being from the tribe of Judah, they weren't that either. Only Judas Iscariot was. And now if you're saying, well, if you're born in Judea, well, none of them were. Jesus was. So you could say, because he's born in Bethlehem, you could say that Jesus was a Judean, but he was never even referred to that. They referred to him as Jesus of Nazareth. So there's really no way to slice that he was, unless you're meaning from the tribe of Israel. And that's where things get interesting. And this is where things matter a lot, especially to the Palestinian people. But let me just finish real quick some of the arguments that I've seen online over these last few days. They'll say, well, no, he celebrated Passover and Hanukkah. We don't have there is no evidence. There is assumption that he studied Passover, that he celebrated Passover. People will say there was one reference in the Bible of him going to the temple during Hanukkah, but the specific reference was he was there to teach. So he was there to basically convert people. Then they'll say, well, Passover, he celebrated Passover. The Last Supper was Passover. I mean, since when does Passover involve the last, the Holy Communion? That is what Jesus was during that supper. People believe it was Passover. The timing is off on that. On a lot of people say the timing's off on that. He introduced the Holy Communion at that dinner. That was not Jewish at all. They'll say, well, the whole thing of saying he was a Jew because he was like, well, he did this and he did that. It's like, so then you're basically trying to make the argument that somebody is a Jew because they believed in God and they went to a church, right? Like you're going to say, oh, if you go to if you call it a synagogue, well, back then they weren't even. I mean, that was just a term that they used because it was the Greek word for a gathering place. They'll say, well, Jesus. And then I get this one a lot. ChatGPT says Jesus was a Jew, so he obviously was. And my response to that is, ask ChatGPT if the COVID vaccine is a vaccine, because it's going to tell you yes. And we all know it's just a shot. It's not the definition of vaccine. That term has changed. And that's my point. When terms change, they take on different meaning, and that different meaning matters. And so when people today say Jesus was a Jew, they're making you believe he was what we view as Jew today and the traditions of the Jews today, which is unrecognizable even to the people, the monotheistic Abrahamic people, the Abrahamic monotheistic people of Jesus's time would not recognize modern day Judaism. Now, also, you could say Jesus wouldn't recognize modern day Christianity, and I guess that's fair enough to say. But the teachings of Jesus were clearly, obviously, Christian teachings, what we today call Christian. And his followers were Nazarenes. Now, they believed that they were following true Judaism, and they believed that the Pharisees are the heretics and that they're the real Jews. But that's where the words get confusing and convoluting to people, but it matters. Now, why does it matter? So it matters because when you use the term Jew for what you really mean is all of the Israelites. Well, what we also know is that of the 12 tribes of Israel, 10 of them were lost, right? What does that mean they were lost? They didn't just disappear like in the, Atlantis. No, they were lost in that they assimilated into other cultures. So some of the tribes became Christian. Some of the tribes became Muslim eventually over time. Some of them got sucked into the Roman way. They scattered and they went all over the world according to the prophecies, right? The 12 tribes scattered all over the world, never to be heard from again, meaning they don't identify as Jews today, but they're still Israelites. So the promise, when they talk about when the Jews today talk about who are the Pharisees, so we got to be clear, the Pharisees today versus the Nazarenes who are the Christians. And if you're going to talk about the 12 tribes of Israel and the prophecies that are leading people to supporting a massacre, a genocide of other people, you have to understand that the 10 tribes disappeared. They got assimilated into other groups, including into Turkey, into Iraq, into Iran, into Italy. A lot of them went the way of Rome. So you've got a lot of modern day Italian Catholics who are from the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. You've got a lot of modern day Turks who are Islamic now, who are who are part of the 10 missing tribes of Israel. You've got a lot of probably Iranians. You probably have people down in Africa, and they don't identify whatsoever as Jews because they're not Judes, one of the surviving tribes that people knew more about, but they are Israelites. Now, the promise from God that the Christians are hanging their hat on, the Christian Zionists, the promise, well, first of all, the promise from God that the Jews are hanging their hat on, the modern day Jews, when they say this land belongs to us because God said so. This was promised land, and it's our land, the Jews. Except the Jews today are the Pharisees. And the promise wasn't just to the Pharisees. They're part of the promise, but they're not the whole promise. They're not the whole promise. Pharisees were just one sect that mostly came from the tribe of Judah, but not all Judeans were Pharisees. And certainly there were way more tribes than Judah. And those tribes, most of them were lost into now other peoples and other religions. And so when the modern Jews today say, this is our land, our promised land, God gave it to the Jews because he gave it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who then became Israel, they're not telling you the whole truth. And that is that the promise was to all of the Israelites. Jesus was an Israelite, but he wasn't a Jew from the tribe of Judah. He wasn't a Pharisee. He was an Israelite. We can't even really call him a Hebrew. We're not even sure if he spoke Hebrew. We know he spoke Aramaic. So this whole idea of this belongs to us, and the whole concept of Judeo-Christian values, these are all, people are just gobbling this up, and they're not even stopping to actually think about, what do you mean by that exactly? So yeah, in the Bible, it says Jesus was a Jew, but that word was used differently then than it is today. Today, it's Pharisees. It's very specific to Pharisees, predominantly the Pharisees. That's the only Judaism that really survived after the Second Temple. So that's not what that word meant in the Bible. They weren't talking about Pharisees. Jesus wasn't a Pharisee. And then when you fast forward to the Zionists, the Christian Zionists who say, well, we've got to have the gathering, we got to get the Jews back to Jerusalem because this is going to cause the second coming, like as if they can manifest this themselves. The promise, the promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was to the Israelites, not just to the Judes. It was to all 12 tribes. And it also was not contingent on their identification of being Jews. It was not contingent on their religion. The promise was a promise, and it was a blanket promise. And the promise was, you will have, the 12 tribes will produce more people than there are stars in the sky. That is not the Jewish people today. They always talk about how there's not very many of us. Well, the prophecy says, or the promise was, that there would be so many people that there would be more people than sands on the beaches and stars in the sky. That's pretty much everybody on planet Earth. And the prophecy of the end of times was that there would be a gathering of Israel into the promised land. That means all 12 tribes, even the tribes that do not identify as Jews, because the only surviving Jews came from Judah, who are the Pharisees. And the prophecy is for all the tribes of Israel to gather together, and then the Messiah would return after, there'd be a great battle, but all of the tribes would be back. That is not exclusive to the Pharisees. So I think that the point of this is, and I know this is all quite confusing, and maybe you still don't agree. Maybe I haven't been able to convince you that Jesus was not a Jew. That the term is used incorrectly today. If we're going to use the term correctly and say, if we're going to use it really correctly, it'd be the tribe of Judah. If we're going to use it somewhat correctly, it would just kind of refer to all Israelites. I would agree he's an Israelite, not a Jude. There's no proof of that. Again, his father wasn't his father. His father was divine. But if you're going to say that, then you'd have to say that a lot of Christians today, the Nazarenes, are Jews. But they don't want to say that. So so we can't. So we have to use the words that are common today. And with today's common words and common understanding, Jesus was absolutely not a Jew. He was a Nazarene, which made him a Christian. That is how they identify today. That is the appropriate labeling for them, not modern day Jew. I'm fine if we're going to go back to the ancient terminology of it, because that would be much more all-encompassing of a lot more people. And there would be a lot less claim to the modern day Jews to that land right now. We'd be able to then say to them, using that argument of, look, there's a lot of other people of other different religions, and you're actually kind of killing those people. And probably the true Jews are the Christians that were massacred in Gaza. Those were probably the actual direct lineage that we're talking about, true Israelites who happened to follow Nazarene way and became Christians, and now they're dead because this other group that claims to be Jews that come from the Pharisaic tradition ended up coming in and saying this land is ours, and now you're dead. So this is why it's important to have this conversation. It's to convince people that the gospel doctrine that they're believing in, that they're hanging their hat on, that they're allowing massacres of people to happen because of, is not being appropriately translated. And it never was up until fairly recently, ever since World War II. Prior to World War II, yes, it was in the Bible, in the King James Version of the Bible, the couple of references to Jesus being a Jew. That was explained very differently, very similarly to the way I'm explaining it to you now. It only became popular after World War II to change the meaning of that and to conflate the term to mean what we mean as Jew today. And these are two different terms. It's kind of like saying when, if you're to watch a movie, or not movie, I guess they didn't exist in like 1850. Or even if you were to watch a movie in the 1940s or something, and somebody, you're so gay, right? They'd say, you're so gay. They didn't mean it the way we mean it today. It's same word, different meaning. This is kind of similar to that. It's the same word. It does have different meanings. I'd say it's more like vaccine, the term vaccine. We have one meaning for the word vaccine. It usually is supposed to mean, at least what many of us believed, was it meant that you would get the vaccine, you could not get the disease. That is now expanded to mean just getting a shot, like the COVID or the flu shot are considered vaccines. They've changed the definition. The definition has been kind of bastardized, And when somebody 20 years from now, or let's say 100 years from now, and they're saying, I'm getting a vaccine, we would say to them, that term meant something different in the 1960s than it does now in 2060. Same word, kind of similar meanings, different meanings pretty much. And now you've conflated them. And that is similar to what has gone on here when it comes to Jesus being a Jew. The term is being bastardized or misinterpreted, or, look, language flows. So I'm not against, I'm not saying that the modern Jews today are not Jews. That is the term that they use to identify. So that's fair and fine and completely fine. But it's just, we have to then go by the definition of what you mean by that when we're starting to say other things. And Jesus just wasn't a modern day Jew. He wasn't a Pharisee. He was a Nazarene. That's just, which are now Christians. They're identified as Christians. And that's the way that it was. So yes, a lot of the same words were used back then, like synagogue and rabbi. They meant something different. Reading from the Torah, Christianity stemmed from all of that. There is no doubt that Christianity stemmed from Judaism, that it was a sect essentially, and that Christians believe to be the true, they believe that they're practicing true Judaism, fulfilled Judaism. That is offensive to today's Jews. They say, how dare you say that? That's why the phrase Christ is king is considered anti-Semitic. It's considered anti-Semitic because it has several different meanings. One, it was used often to convert Jews, often forcibly, back in certain times. Many of those Jews who are not Jews today, they're now Christians. And it was used as a forcible way to persecute people. It also it's meant to say that Jesus is true fulfilled Judaism. And so you're practicing heretical Judaism. That's offensive to people, of course, because people have their beliefs. They believe in their beliefs, and that's totally fair and fine. I think it's fair and fine to believe in your beliefs, so as long as your beliefs don't hurt other people. But unfortunately, there is a belief system right now that is very much harming a lot of people. And I think that is where a lot of us draw a line on beliefs and say, like, you can't believe in certain ideologies if those ideologies are going to harm people. But I think this one just has to have some clarification. So that is it. That's ultimately, Christianity is centered on the belief that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, the Savior of humanity, whose life, death, and resurrection provides the only means for humanity to be reconciled with God and receive eternal life. And Jesus 100% believes that. And that is what makes Christianity separate from Pharisees. That is a massive distinction. And Jesus totally believed that. Therefore, he was not a Jew by today's definition of it. An Israelite, sure. But a lot of people are, and they are entitled to that land just as much as the Pharisees from Judah are entitled to that land. And there should be no reason to massacre people who are just as much probably from an Israelite tribe, a descendant from an Israelite tribe, as those that are flooding the land, claiming that it's theirs and solely theirs. Thanks for watching this clip from the full Kim Iverson show. If you want to watch the full show, visit KimIversonShow.com. The show airs every Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Again, KimIversonShow.com. See you there.